Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Please, the presentation of Peter on screen. Chan. Do you all know Peter Todd? Yes? Big applause for Peter. Thank you for coming. He's the second time here, and he said, yes, I want to go to LABITCONF this year. So, welcome.
Thank you. I guess I don't actually have one of those little clickers to advance the slides, which could be kind of handy. But so basically, I know all you guys are late for lunch, so I'm going to see if I can go explain open timestamps and essentially what a timestamp proof is and so on in about 15 minutes. So with that, how does this thing work? There you go. So quite simply, what is a timestamp proof? Well, it's a proof that some message M existed prior to some time t. Of course, I put proof in quotations because when you think about it, I mean, how could math possibly know anything about time? Obviously, we're going to go fudge some details here, but from a practical point of view, that's exactly what it is. And your real question is, well, why would it be useful to know when a message existed? Well, it's carbon dating for data, basically. You know, when you go authenticate like an old artwork or something, you authenticate an old artifact, you go use carbon dating. You say, hey, you know, when did this thing exist? When was it created? If you authenticate, you know, an old document, you'll drag some expert in and it'll do his ink analysis or whatever, and it'll say, yeah, it was probably made in the 1900s rather than yesterday. And that's important because attackers don't have time machines. You know, even Satoshi couldn't go back in time and like rewrite things in the past. So often if you can go say something definitely happened in the past, you can rule out whole classes of attacks. You know, one of the simplest examples, which is actually relevant to Bitcoin directly, is PGP. I'm not sure you can actually read it, but essentially that's an actual output of the git command, looking at a PGP-signed git commit. That particular one is from Peter Wool, and some of you may know that Peter Wool had one of his PGP keys potentially compromised. Well, what PGP is saying here is, you know, the key's being compromised, it's revoked, I can't actually verify the signature. Because after all, the whole point of compromise is saying now the attacker can make a signature. Well, that date on that says, you know, August, I think, 4th, 2015. But I have no way of knowing if that signature was actually created then. After all, Craig Wright, for example, famously backdated PGP signatures and, you know, PGP keys. So it's a perfect example why you can't know. That's one of the things Open Timestamps does. It says, hey, I know that this git commit existed prior to February 19, 2017. Now, fortunately, I haven't lost my PGP keys, but if I did, you'd still be able to verify it, provided you knew when I lost them. Again, the guy who stole the keys, he can't go back in time. Here's another example, a bit more complex one. Apparently, this is up on the Android App Store and actually uses open timestamps, and it's called Airproof. And the idea is that when you have an Airbnb, you want to go make sure that the status of the apartment, house, whatever you're renting, is proven, so that your host can't go say after the fact, hey, you know, you went and like kicked in a window or something. So the idea is you go around, get a video of the status of the place you're renting, and timestamp it. After the fact, if the host goes and says, well, hang on, you know, there's a hole in the wall, you can go say, well, you know, when I created this video, there obviously wasn't. Or equally, when I created this video, just as I checked in, well, there was a hole in the wall. You know, the previous guest had punched a hole in the wall. Simple as that. Of course, in reality, I mean, this is like icing on the cake. Even just having the video is probably good enough with most hosts. But, you know, it's a good example of timestamping. So the question is, how do you actually do this under the hood? Well, you do this through something called commitment operations. And this is kind of a generalization. It's basically saying we have a proof that a message M1 existed prior to a message M2. And what that means is the second message committed to the first one, in the sense that if it guarantees the first one existed prior, well, if you change the first one, the second one must change. Here's a trivial example. I mean, what if I just have a function that prepends X with hello? Because if I go put in world in there, Obviously, if I change the hello part or the world part, the output must change. Trivial example, but there's your simplest commitment operation. Of course, mostly the thing you're probably thinking of if you know a bit of crypto is hash functions. And the way this works quite simple. You take in your message, you run it through this hash, and out spits this random number. So big, in fact, that it kind of goes off the edge of my screen. And because it's a random number per message, if I try to guess 2 messages that output the same number, the same hash digest, it's infeasible. There's 2 to the 256 of them. I mean, I could be sitting there with a supercomputer made from all the stars in the galaxy and some orgy of computation, and they're not going to find 2 messages, assuming, of course, the math works. If you know about SHA-1, you'll know sometimes the math can break, but if the math works, this is a commitment operation. From the second part, the 7FA whatever thing, there's no way I can come up with another message, another hello world that ends up leading to the same thing. And the final bit, and this is where we kind of fudge and add something other than math, is attestations. Here's another timestamping service called GuardTime. And the way their system works is after using all these commitment operations to create a chain going from your data to their final commitment, they literally bind an ad in a newspaper and publish it there. Well, a newspaper is widely witnessed. There's thousands of copies hanging around. And in theory, if you go off, say, a local library and look up that newspaper, it'd be pretty hard for GuardTime to send in some teams of ninjas, go silently replace them in the night. Not likely to happen. Because there's a date on there, you can work backwards and say, that data existed as of that date. Well, the data that went into commitment operation existed prior to that data. Data went to that commitment operation existed prior to that data, et cetera, et cetera. But this is pre-Bitcoin tech. Hanging around libraries is a real pain, and you'd much rather use something like Bitcoin. So that's output of open timestamps verifying that some data existed. And in this case, again, you probably can't read it, but it's essentially saying Bitcoin attests that the data existed as of April 23rd, 2013. So through Bitcoin, I have proof that that bit of data existed prior to that time. And the reason why I can do this is Bitcoin blocks contain a time field. We need this for the consensus. We need this to retarget how difficult it is to create a Bitcoin block. For open timestamps, we can go leverage that and reuse it for our own purposes. And if you think that Bitcoin is working appropriately, that time will be accurate to, if you want to be conservative, say a day. Real thing is about a couple, few hours under some conditions, but long story short, you say a day. If I'm talking about, was this PGP key compromised? A day is fine. I want to know, did this thing exist like in January or yesterday? That's all I care about. I don't need to know down to the second. And that's how most timestamping stuff works. But again, how does this really work under the hood? Well, open timestamps, the client, can spit out the actual math proof. And I think people often find math proofs a little intimidating, but when you think about it, it's just a set of logical instructions, and each instruction does something, and we know it worked. And the way you can read this is say, well, up at the top, we had our initial data, 37 EC whatever thing, and then each line under there is an instruction. It says to the verifier, all right, you had this data, now do this commitment operation. We know that the input to commitment operation means output must change. So if I prepend that input with that, and then append that input with that, and then hash it again, and prepend and so on, as we go down to the bottom, every single output depended on the input. Here's the next page of that. Right at the very bottom, now we have a new type of instruction. It says, once you've done all those math operations, now verify that the result you got at the very end happens to be the Merkle root of Bitcoin block number 232,756. So your open timestamps client does all that math, does all those steps, and at the very end it says, all right, let's go ask our Bitcoin node, does that block have that attestation? If everything works, the Bitcoin node will come back and say, yeah, it does actually. Oh, and by the way, the time field in that block was, in this case, I think 2013 or something. Very simple type of math proof. And really, the only next thing, once you have this, is, well, can we make it a little convenient? Like, if I want to create a timestamp, do I want to go wait till a Bitcoin block is found? That's like 10 minutes at least. Not to mention, I don't want to have to do my own transaction just to go make a timestamp. I mean, what if I want to timestamp 10,000 things? Well, this is what open timestamps actually looks like when you create a timestamp. I'm saying stamp some file, hello world, and it's submitting it to these things called calendars. And as you can see, that returned in about 1.6 seconds. That's a lot shorter than a Bitcoin block. Well, the final piece of the puzzle to all this is something called a pending attestation. So all that's saying is, I have these servers. One's called Alice, one's called Bob, and one's called Finney. I think the cryptographers in the audience will know where the names come from. And what those servers do is they say, well, you can submit data to be timestamped. And I will give you back a partial proof, a partial set of instructions that lead to something that I have committed to eventually timestamp. And my promise as one of these calendar servers is I will make sure this is timestamped in Bitcoin. Might take me an hour or two, maybe a whole day, probably an hour or two. But when I do that, I'll keep all that data leading all the way to a Bitcoin block like we saw before. And when your client goes to verify and asks me for that data, I'll give you it back. So in this case, we've actually forked our proof into 3 different of these servers. And each one of those pending attestations says, when you verify, ask this server for the rest of the proof. Ask Alice, ask Bob, and ask Finney. And if any one of these servers gives you back the completion of the proof, you can save that indefinitely. Now you no longer need to trust them, and you can fully verify all the way back to Bitcoin. So long story short, I call this a semi-trusted model. These servers can make your day bad, they can fail to timestamp something, but once the process is done, they're completely out of the picture. It's all back to Bitcoin. And because these servers can timestamp everyone's Bitcoin transactions, everyone's digest, everyone's messages, this is essentially a free service. Under the hood, there's a Merkle tree and some other optimizations. From the point of the client, all it knows is that this magical thing happens and we get a promise back. And you guys want to go to lunch, so I'm not going to explain that part. The important bit, though, is a word of caution. Timestamping is actually a pretty weak primitive. It often doesn't do what you want it to do. And in fact, my earlier example of airproof is an example where timestamping fails. Now remember how I said, and I kind of glossed over this bit, you could go show the host that there was a timestamp on the state of the apartment. Well, there's 2 possible states. When you get to your Airbnb and when you leave. Now when you get to your Airbnb, you're trying to go prove that the status of the Airbnb prior to a point in time when you arrived was something. Maybe there's a hole in the wall. The problem is when you leave your Airbnb, that's not actually what you're trying to prove. Like imagine if I want to go have a rocking party, which I hear many of you had last night, and I go take 2 videos, one right as I arrive and one maybe 10 minutes later. I can wait to timestamp that second one right up to the point where I'm supposed to leave, and it'll show, hey, look, the apartment's totally clean when I left. No holes in the walls. Meanwhile, my rocking party has knocked down at least 3 walls and the toilet's missing. Unfortunately, timestamping didn't actually do the right thing here. It worked for half the solution, but not the other. There's other crypto that will help, but I think you guys want to go to lunch. So I'll give you the other big category. And in fact, this is interesting because Satoshi actually got this one wrong in the white paper. And imagine you're trying to timestamp, say, a title deed, a document saying you own a house. The problem is all the timestamp did is prove that that document was old. It did not prove that you're the only alleged owner of that house. So if I go sell my house to Alice, I timestamp that document, I give her all that lovely proof, it looks all official. I could simultaneously make another document, also timestamped, selling that same house to Bob. Obviously, Alice and Bob are going to have a problem when they try to figure out who actually owned the house. What you actually needed to do there was something more than just timestamp. You need to prevent a double spend. And unfortunately, like I say, Satoshi actually described this wrong in the white paper. He called Bitcoin and the blockchain a timestamping service, which it simply isn't. It's actually something that prevents a double spend, which is much harder. And if you do have that type of problem, I'm also working on tech related to this, which is the notion of a single-use seal. And the analogy is like, well, these physical seals you see on shipping containers and things like that. Suppose I want to go buy something from a foreign country, maybe Canada, and ship it over here. And I ask my Canadian counterparty, when you close up that shipping container, seal it and tell me what's the number on that seal. Now, these physical seals, the guarantee is no two seals will ever be created with the same number. So when I get it at the other end, and I inspect the shipping container, if everything's authentic and the number matches, I know that what was in that container had not changed since it left Canada. Well, a digital single-use seal is the same concept. It's, I have this thing, I close it over some data, and if it's secure, I can only do this once. And, long story short, this is the type of thing you more often than not actually go want. So, I guess my final point, feel free to try it, just make sure of its limitations. And with that, thank you.
Hello. Okay, bueno, voy a explicar, please stay on stage, yes. Voy a explicar cómo va a seguir el tema del almuerzo, como les había dicho hoy a la mañana, antes de que llegaran todos. Vamos a ir repartiendo, ustedes pueden salir si quieren, ¿está claro? Sí, van a poder ir a comer afuera, pero vamos a repartir el almuerzo acá adentro también, para que puedan aprovechar mejor los pitches de los emprendedores y de las startups y de las ICOs que se están lanzando básicamente todos de acá a diciembre. Y mientras tanto repartimos, que ahora por favor si puede ir entrando la comida, se agradece. Mientras tanto repartimos la comida, Efraín, ¿te encargas? Vamos a hacer como hicimos el bloque pasado, vamos a hacer un Q&A de las preguntas que se le canten. And I'm asking Peter, yes, if you want to stay, we will do like 15 minutes of Q&A.
Sounds good.
For you, for me, for whoever they want, yes. So it's open to any kind of question. Yes. Can we have a mic here?
So, my name is Valentina, and I follow you on Twitter. And I just had a doubt, or like curiosity about a question, about a tweet that you posted like a few days ago about net neutrality. You're saying in that tweet that it's really important for everybody to be like worried about that issue that we have right now about net neutrality. And I was just wondering if you know if there is like any, I don't know, project or anything going on in blockchain about that.
That might be my simultaneously least and most blockchain-related question I've gotten in ages. And I say it's least, of course, because it sounds like it's just net neutrality. I mean, what's the internet got to do with stuff? But in reality, these blockchain systems that we have actually have very deep relations to things like net neutrality and ways to go and make these kind of attacks on the internet irrelevant. And the simple answer, the reason why this is true is Bitcoin's security model assumes that data is easy to spread. The reason why that's needed is essentially because, going back to my double spend example, half of a double spend looks valid. If you just get the property title that says Alice now owns my house, Alice thinks it's a valid transaction. If Bob just gets, Bob now owns my house, Bob thinks it's a valid transaction. The only way that they're going to find out fraud has happened if they go and compare notes. And censorship can prevent those people from comparing notes. And that's really what it boils down to. And in Bitcoin, if we're unable to go have ways of communicating freely, which is ultimately what net neutrality boils down to, with a whole bunch of complexity attached, we're in deep trouble because we're not going to have the ability to ensure that miners, for instance, are well connected to each other. Now, in terms of non-political things that can help ensure this, unfortunately, we're kind of hampered by the laws of physics. I mean, to send a small amount of data around the world is relatively easy. As an example, I think, Nick Szabo, actually, I can't remember which, Scaling Bitcoin, did an interesting presentation on low bandwidth, low power radio to distribute Bitcoin blockchain data. As you may have heard, Blockstream also did something related to this with satellites. But again, I mean, these are kind of poor measures, and they only can transmit a small amount of data. If we want to go scale up Bitcoin, we're going to be very reliant on the nets being free and open to all. And unfortunately, I don't have great solutions to this.
How do you feel about the actual distribution of consensus? How do you feel that it's being eventually achieved or not a real distributed consensus right now, or powers are not evenly distributed? How do you feel about that?
I mean, for what Bitcoin needs to function, consensus is very evenly distributed in the sense that Bitcoin can work with very, very low bandwidth, very high latency internet connections. You can keep in consensus with the rest of Bitcoin with just a few K per second of data. So in that sense, it's very resilient. But we want Bitcoin to scale up. And while things like sharding and stuff could go get us there, they still end up needing, in aggregate, more data to be passed around. And if we're restricted to, say, sending data around on radio signals, the simple reality is there just isn't that much radio bandwidth out there. We're forced to use things like fiber, and fiber is inherently very centralized in the sense that, if we have a fiber line from there to there, well, governments know where it is. I mean, they can do all kinds of things to go block it, and there just aren't good solutions to this.
Ok. Bueno, ¿alguien quiere hacer otra pregunta? De lo que sea, ¿eh? Sí. Shout it.
My question is about the scalability. Thank you. I agree that the solution is on a second layer, but I want to know your thoughts about the long term. The first question is basically if you think that, for instance, on the Lightning networks, it will cause like centralizations that it's called banks of Bitcoin. And the second question is basically, what do you think in the long term if a common person will be able to do an on-chain transaction, or just the on-chain transaction will be done by institutions or banks or banks or whatever?
So, I mean, the question there is, I think a long-term question. I'm going to answer this with a long-term answer, which is let's go look down. Well, all right, in Bitcoin, 2 years is long-term. Let's go look down 2 years and go say, what kind of technology will we have available? And I'm actually of the opinion that layer 2 solutions in the long run are very suboptimal. I want to go see on-chain, if you will, payments themselves scale. And I actually think this is definitely possible. And maybe just giving you an example, I mean, the thing I alluded to earlier that I published, single-use seals via proof of publication, the way it basically works is, now, I explained briefly the single-use seal idea, which is, and you can imagine, once you have that primitive, I could, for instance, transfer tokens around. I start off at the Genesis token, and every seal closes over a new seal, which is controlled by someone else. And that creates a chain of seals and witnesses to the fact those seals were validly closed. Now, if I have a magical seal protocol, this works, right? I can go just verify that that chain is correct and I'm good to go. And if I want to go give you that asset, I can just give you the data proving that. You go and tell me, hey, which seal do you want me to close it over? I close it, and I just give you the rest of the data right back to the Genesis. Well, what are the numbers on that? They're actually pretty good, which is if you can get a seal down to, say, K of data, if you're updating, say, every 2 hours, that works out to be roughly 5 megs of data per year. I mean, I can send you that over my phone, over the internet, pretty quickly. That's a practical system. question is, how do we then make this usable? Well, in a centralized model where you're willing to sacrifice censorship resistance, I think technically this is quite easy. And the way that works is you use Bitcoin to secure a secondary ledger, and then you publish signatures relating to secondary seals on this. Point being is that because you're doing full verification, the people running this ledger can't lie to you. They can withhold data, they can censor your money, but they can't lie to you about the status. Whereas in other systems, and I think usages of Ethereum for fintech is an example, they tend to work in a way where someone fully verifies and you have to go trust them, or you have to get the whole chain yourself, which isn't really feasible. Now, the hard part is, well, how do you get a system like that and then make it censorship resistant? And while I wouldn't be confident to say I necessarily have the solution, I have reasonable confidence that we will find solutions. And I think we're going to find solutions that on the order of 2, 3, maybe 5 years. And my suspicion is Lightning is going to buy us enough time to get to that next level of scaling.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hello. Can you comment on the usage of formal verification methods for the development of especially smart contract platforms? Maybe specifically about Cardano, which is the only platform that I know of which uses, science.
Well, and I'll just say in general, there's a lot of excitement about formal verification, but I think some of the excitement seems to come from people who are either really, really heavily involved in formal verification or have never actually used it. Why I say this is it's very interesting academically, but actually adding formal verification to a realistic program is very difficult. And unfortunately, we've seen tons of examples where formally verified protocols have turned out to have exploits because the formal verification was wrong in the first place. There's a recent example with, if I remember correctly, OpenVPN, I believe. Don't quote me on that one, but some VPN thing, where they formally verified that the protocol was correct, that it would never leak keys and so on, but unfortunately, the formal verification didn't prove the right thing. While it proved that you wouldn't leak a key, it wouldn't prove that you couldn't change the key to something that was insecure. And because of that, they had a massive security exploit in a supposedly formally verified system. Now, is that to say that formal verification is a bad thing? No, it's a great thing. It's just probably the first step is to say, can we build simpler systems that are easy to understand? If I would say, try to formally verify a simplicity script on Ethereum, I think it would be much more valuable to instead focus on how can we create a simpler system with less state than something like Ethereum? How can we create something that you're likely to understand it fully, including all the nuances that are going to lead to a security attack, and then the formal verification is just an extra check on this, rather than having a system where you're really relying on the formal verification for step one. So yes, I'm kind of excited about formal verification, but no, I don't think it's a magic bullet.
Yes, I had one question. You mentioned in your top 3 projects the anonymity on Bitcoin. I was wondering how is that going to be implemented in the time frame roughly?
It's kind of hard to predict. Even with the recent bulletproof successes from Blockstream, as Andrew Polstra said in his email earlier this week, we're still not quite at the point where we'd actually say we'd want to put that on Bitcoin. The transactions are too slow to verify and they're just too big. They're a lot better than they were before, but they're still not quite there. The other issue is, given how controversial SegWit was, I would not be surprised if adding more privacy to Bitcoin is seen as a really negative thing by some miners, and we may see a repeat of all the silly drama we got about SegWit. I'd hope we don't, but I'm not going to bet against it.
I'm almost sure, this is a discussion I have with Franco generally. I think that one of the main future decisions that we will need to take is if we will want anonymity or not on top of Bitcoin. I think that will have a very big discussion, and it will not only be technical now, yes, but it will be also very, very political and very, very depending on what do we want Bitcoin to be, no?
Although it's also notable that Lightning already gives you a ton of privacy against many attackers. Quite simply because Lightning transactions, they don't end up on the chain. So let's suppose a worst possible case. I am directly connected to the NSA's Lightning node, and the people I'm paying are one hop away from the NSA's Lightning node. Obviously, everything that's going to go through that Lightning node is going to be completely tracked by the NSA. But that's still better than the status quo if I'm worried about North Korea getting my transaction. Because I'm pretty sure the NSA and North Korea don't collaborate that much. Maybe a little, but not that much. And they're probably not going to give them my transaction. So that's still an improvement over the status quo. Similarly, if we're talking about the NSA's node and we're talking about some chain analysis firm, chances are they're not cooperating. So even in your worst possible case, the privacy is improved. Thus, arguably, you might go and put your conspiracy hat on, the tinfoil hat I should add, and say maybe that they were blocking SegWit because it would make Lightning easier. That's a plausible thing.
Yes, but you are going, if you're talking about a second layer or Lightning, yes, that's an opt-in, yes. The difference is when you do it on the blockchain, yes, and there's not opt-in of anonymity or not.
Well, from the point of view of many regulators, opt-in is unacceptable. There's a lot of people that say that the fact that you can opt into privacy at all is just unacceptable. And equally, in any system that gives you privacy, you can obviously selectively opt out by proving to the people you wish to prove what your transactions actually were. As an example, when I've done consulting for fintech, for big banks and so on, after all, I worked for R3 at one point. A major concern from those kind of clients and those kind of companies is privacy. If I'm some massive multinational bank, I don't want to be giving away my transaction info to other people. I want to create systems where I can very selectively give that away. All right, I'm a massive multinational bank. I'm probably going to end up giving it away to some regulators. But again, in my example, at least North Korea doesn't get it, at least Russia doesn't get it, at least my competitors don't get that information. And I can do this even in something as private as, say, Zcash, by selectively revealing data. Whereas I think the real issues from the point of view of many people, privacy should be banned entirely. Look at Germany, where there's a proposal recently to add backdoors to literally every single digital device. One of the examples being, let's suppose you have a car alarm. Well, what if the police want to break into your car and install a tracker? Well, one part of that proposal is we'd have a backdoor so the police could call the car manufacturer and say, disable that alarm for the next 5 minutes while we break into it. And that's coming from Germany, a place that's gone through 2 dictatorships. So, there are people who are very anti-privacy, and unfortunately, that's just going to be battle for a while.
Okay, we will do one more question, and I think the rest of the team is ready. Yes? It can be technical, it can be non-technical, yes? We can benefit that we have Peter. Franco, bueno. You too, come on.
I'm a little confused. I have all this information that I'm supposed to invest in all these ICOs. And then I have this other information that showed up for 15 minutes that said, no, they're all bad, just Bitcoin. What's your view of this?
I think with a lot of this stuff, you go ask who financially benefits from that advice. If I'm starting an ICO, or even if I'm an academic, who a lot of my funding is coming from ICOs, well, obviously I'm going to think ICOs are the next best thing. In my case, I personally, I'm a consultant. I get my money by convincing clients I'm sufficiently honest that they want to go give me money and get my opinions. So for me, my incentive is to go say, well, some ICOs are bad, some ICOs are good. This is a very sophisticated opinion. You should be paying me $600 an hour for this. And I think
You're non-objective.
Well, that's my incentive. And I think the real thing is really ask yourself, do you actually understand how this works? One of the things I really like about open timestamps is I can go to even reasonably non-technical people and explain to them from top to bottom how this entire thing works from scratch to the point where after maybe a few days of study, they could probably even verify one of these proofs by hand. That's the kind of decision-making, or that's the kind of information I want people to have to make a decision on. Whereas if you see an ICO that looks like it's mainly about bamboozling you, and trying to present this really complex thing where you don't fully understand it. Well, if I'm a fraudster, the easiest way I can get away with fraud and convince people is if they don't understand what's actually going on. So that's
Sí.
my cautionary tale.
De alguna forma stays on you to understand and take the decision what's the real, no? If it's the ICO, non-ICO, I mean, you need to decide, actually. Franco,
Yes, Peter.
and this is the last one, I guess.
I don't remember where, but I read you said, maybe it was Twitter, that you do not completely agree with Bitcoin Core's roadmap today. So what will you change in that roadmap?
I need all of them.
Well, I think the main thing Bitcoin Core gets wrong is not asking, where are we going to go like 3 years down the line? They've done absolutely amazing work pushing the envelope of what the current protocol can go do. But I don't see very much interest in saying, all right, how can we go, say, design sharding into the system? And unfortunately, I think part of that's because it's a lot more fun in many cases to go and eke out that extra, 10, 20, 30% of performance. Or in the case of Bitcoin Core, since Satoshi's release, I think we've gotten about 3 orders of magnitude performance. But in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't buy you that much. We're not going to get another 3 orders of magnitude performance increase. We might get 1 if we're really lucky. And I quite frankly think more research needs to be done into how are we going to go next. Because the reality is, Lightning isn't going to buy us more than maybe 2 orders of magnitude scaling. Now that's pretty good, but I bought my first Bitcoin at like 20 cents. So from that to 10,000 is a lot more than 2 orders of magnitude scaling. And for the record, by the way, the best financial decision in my life was buying Bitcoin at 20 cents. The worst financial decision in my life was only buying $20 worth.
Bueno, a big applause for Peter Todd.